Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello, and good evening. We have a very special honor, a very special presenter this evening, Dr. Liisa Kauppinen. And this will be her final presentation for this week here at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. We've kept her busy. She's been networking and presenting to various groups, and we have to tell her how much we appreciate that. We decided we had to have this presentation tonight because of the importance of this topic, the legal rights for deaf individuals, and this is her area of speciality. We also have a few interpreters with us this evening. We have Jackie Schertz here on my right. She will be signing in American Sign Language what Liisa will be talking about, who will be signing her way. Now, she may be using some international sign language as well as ASL. So those of you in the audience who choose may want to follow what Jackie's interpreting for her or follow Liisa's presentation directly. Before we start, I'd like to give you a little story about how I had the opportunity to meet Liisa. It began in 1993. Prior to that time, I had moved to Rochester, and I'd come from Zimbabwe, Africa. And I had worked in Zimbabwe for a couple of years, and then I came to Rochester, to the University of Rochester, to teach in their ASL and Deaf Studies program. And I had the chance to work with two very significant individuals. One, Ted Sapala, who was the director of the ASL program at the University of Rochester, and his wonderful wife, Liisa Newport. And Liisa was a specialist in language acquisition. Ted, of course, is an expert in linguistics. Now, I didn't realize Liisa was a good friend of theirs and a colleague, and she was also a friend of Markku Jokinen, who's known as Markku, who also hails from Finland and is deaf. He came to Rochester at one point for a year to study with Ted Sapala and Liisa. So I had just arrived here from Zimbabwe at the same time, and Markku was here, and we had a chance to meet and became fast friends during the first year. Markku told me many stories about Liisa and the significant role that she played and her actions as an activist on a global level. And she worked for the betterment of the deaf community, and her interest and passion was helping deaf people. And I was much moved by what she said. Liisa realized that many countries didn't have the same rights as we do here, and so she worked as an advocate to fight for those rights, for those different stories. So I heard many stories from Markku about Liisa. And then at one point, Liisa came to Rochester, but she didn't visit RIT. At that point, she was a guest of the University of Rochester. And I remember that, and then many years passed, and we had a chance to bring her here to RIT. And she's been here for the entire week, which is quite a significant event. And I can't tell you how important this woman is. I can't explain all the awards she's won and summarize all the activities she's done for the betterment of the deaf community. But I will tell you, she's won some of the most prestigious awards in the world. The Human Rights Prize, and that was given to her last December for her work with deaf community and the rights of deaf people.
Dee Dee, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. You have a terrific memory as well. I'd like to welcome you all this evening. I love speaking on this topic, the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the reason for that is because we have worked tirelessly to improve the rights of deaf individuals throughout the world, and this convention is witness to that. I'm going to sign what this is called, and again, it's the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and this is how I sign it. So I'm going to say CRPD for the rest of the evening. Let me give you a little bit of background on how this came to be. The first time I was called to a meeting to discuss this topic, various disability organizations were represented. CRPD at that time was just a concept that was being developed. The World Federation of the Deaf gave me 4 tenets and 4 mandates that they were hoping that I would achieve in working with the folks on this convention. One was for deaf-blind, one was for the identity of deaf individuals, one was for gay and lesbians, and the other was for sign language in education. These were the 4 mandates that I was to work on in conjunction with this convention. Now, if you think about it, well, let me go back to yesterday. Yesterday, I worked with the young people here at NTID, and I asked the young folks that I was meeting with, I said to them, suppose, for example, you were to go to a different country and have a different experience. You landed in a place where you were a deaf person and you met a person who was mobility impaired. Have you ever had that experience to meet these people and work with various people? So I asked the individuals who were there last night. Several of them said yes, they had had that opportunity. And I said, if you had a chance to communicate with these people, what would it be like? And if you were to ask them, what did they know about deafness, what do you think they would say? So again, at my meeting, the first thing that was important to me was to have sign language recognized as an official language in various countries. Governments of the countries around the world were very hesitant to look at this in a positive way. To them, it was like swatting a mosquito that kept bothering them and flying around their head, but I kept persisting and asking, and as more as they swatted at me, the more I asked. There are many linguistics who have helped me to prove and create the definition of signed language to be put into this convention. I will get into this a little bit more as I get into my topic later this evening. Another thing I was working on was interpreting, and people wondered, interpreting, does that mean that they're going to yell at you across the room because you can't hear well? And I said, no, they're sign language interpreters. Many countries around the world have no professional sign language interpreters, therefore access. Often they feel that spoken language is the only appropriate and official way to communicate. Another mandate that I was working on was sign language, and working with sign language for different countries and recognizing those languages indigenous to those people. Governments, again, thought this was a little bit complicated and didn't understand why there was not one sign language that could be used along the world. For example, Braille is one system, and they were equating sign language to Braille, not understanding the differences between the 2 communication modes. I tried to explain to them, and at the time I was at the UN talking to the president of the UN, at which I listened to his comments, and then I tried to give an example to help them understand. I said, for example, in the world, we have 6,000 recognized individual spoken languages. Suppose there was only one. If you look here at the UN, we have 6, 7 different interpreters in booths providing us spoken language communication to each of our delegates in their own indigenous languages. After I explained that to them, it seems as though the questions about sign language quelled. Then they came to the idea that needing interpreters might not necessarily be the way to go. And I had to then get up again and explain to them that because deaf people can't hear and because they use sign language, they need professional interpreters to communicate from language to language. So I went through these 4 points again. Another point that I had to work with was education. They were saying that sign language and education must not necessarily go hand in hand. One part of this was culture and deaf culture. I tried to explain to them. We look at things like poetry, and we talk about the qualities and the inherent loves of deaf culture that is passed from person to person. These conversations went on over and over again through these meetings. Recognizing sign language was a must. In America, you have many tenets that point to rights for people. A lot of these languages are written in a way that's difficult for people to understand. WFD, the World Federation for the Deaf, wanted a simplistic yet inclusive way to describe what spoken and sign languages meant throughout the world. So we simplified our language to say signed languages, and spoken languages. And as simple as it was very difficult to get it to that point before it was recognized. The other 3 tenets that we talked about, we also rehashed over and over again, and other concerns were brought up along the way. That was a big goal for WFD that we did accomplish, and we are very proud of that incorporation of that language within the convention. Hearing people have not looked at us and said, here, we will grant you these rights. We have to work on our own to prove the necessity and the need for these throughout the world, which we have done. Physical barriers are present in the world for those who have mobility issues, whether they be in facilities, whether they be on roadways. People speak often about physical impairments and how to help overcome folks in those situations. And the UN is one of those places that have tried to support and fight for the rights of people who are disabled. But sign language, up until recently, has not been included. At one point when I was at one of the meetings, I did mention that we have talked quite a bit about people who are physically disabled. They talked for a little bit about folks who are blind and had visual impairments. But as soon as deafness, hard of hearing, and sign language came up, it seemed very uncomfortable for those involved in the conversation. I listened very carefully to what they had to say, and I thought about WFD and the mandates and the goals that we had set. There are many universities, associations for the deaf, all around the world that need to work in a global partnership to try and further the needs of those in our situation. It's important for people to know what their rights are, because if you know what your rights are, then you can stand up and continue to make things grow. If we continue to stay oppressed and be unaware and uneducated about our rights, nothing will change. We will not break a glass ceiling until we all know what we can do and what we are capable of doing and what the world will support us to do. I'd like to explain the word convention. It has several different meanings, but in this case, it's a legally binding document. This is a global document that we are hoping that nations will join and sign and ratify. Finland, for example, has been a signatory of this document. The United States has not signed the convention, and Marcoux, who was just mentioned by Dee Dee, has retired from his position as the president, but has been working on that for some time. During Obama's administration, Judy Heumann is working on programs and trying to help us ratify this. We also have people in the Senate and in the House who are trying to ratify this. The Democratic Party is in full support of the convention, but the Republicans, unfortunately, are not. Are you any Republicans in here? Because if so, I would like to speak to you afterwards, because I really would like for you to know that we are all people and you should support us in every way. I'd like to give you a bit of history of how this all came to be. The United Nations have different documents and proposals and declarations that have been made throughout the year. Often these have focused on people with disabilities. The UN looks for opportunities for equal rights for people who have disabilities. If various governments throughout the world do not sign this and do not ratify this, then we have no bite or teeth in this convention to make it work throughout the world and actually enforce it. The Mexican government proposed that we write this convention. There were various meetings at the UN in New York City where this was discussed. This happened originally in 2001, that the Mexicans had proposed to the UN Assembly that we have an ad hoc committee that would discuss these rights. One of the rights, we have monitoring issues. We had various persons giving speeches and trying to persuade and explain to people what the purposes of these conventions were. Voting rights were not extended to the general members of the UN, but only to government officials, which we had many discussions and many interactions with, trying to explain the purposes and try to educate them on the reasons for developing this convention. The convention does not contain any new rights. Oftentimes people point to old documents and old ways of explaining this, but this is a separate situation for the example of sign language. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has particular language written within each article. The basic purpose of this was to eliminate discrimination and oppression, and language pointed to that within the articles. At that point, sign language was not included as an official language, but now because it is recognized over the world as a true and living language, that has now been put into the document as a new portion. The convention contains no language discrimination. The UN focuses, the document says clearly that this is on human rights and the rights of all, and language is a universal right of all people internationally. It is a part of our human rights as humans and those of us who live throughout the world. This change of perception has made me and others very happy. WFD asked me to speak to linguistics, and it doesn't necessarily mean research in linguistics. It means linguistic communities throughout the world. Those people who have indigenous languages have the right to use them. It's not just language rights, but we use the word linguistic rights. And that means that all people around the world have the ability to use whatever language is pertinent to their life and to their culture. Additionally, I represented WFD as well as Marcoux, and also Colin, who is the current president of WFD. We went several times together in a group to represent the needs and the wishes of WFD. For the first 5 years, there were no hard of hearing people involved. I mean, they would be there, but they would not necessarily participate. I shouldn't have signed it maybe quite that way. They didn't see themselves as having their own rights or having their own needs. When we went to the UN, we asked for captioning, and that was granted to us. But the hard of hearing people were not forefront in asking for their rights and were not assertive enough. It came from us, the deaf community, to then turn to the hard of hearing folks and try to help further their cause as well. There were many proposals that were made from the hard of hearing people to the UN to have, for example, technology, captioning, to aid them in their understanding. And of course, deaf people were able to use those technologies as well. I would like to say that it's gotten better, but over time, the organizations for hard of hearing folks, people from around the world, were relatively weak. They didn't have very much power. And it seems as though ASL spreads, for example, in the United States very quickly, and our youth is very powerful and very assertive in making their needs known. But the hard of hearing community does not seem to have that same advantage. There were people from Japan who were represented that showed various technologies that they used to communicate with their hard of hearing individuals, and that was a very positive experience. So I think that the United States has helped Japan to develop some of those technologies, which has then come here and then been shared throughout the world. Mental health issues are also a concern, and psychological problems are also a concern. There were many proposals and many actions to try and help further the needs of peoples in these communities, but networking through this disability group was difficult. For some reason, working with the UN seemed to be difficult. Presidents of the organizations would write documents and letters and propose them, but the ways in which it was handled was not necessarily something that worked well with the UN contingents. For example, in the Finnish government, who is someone who I've met and spoken with, said that they would work with those groups from Australia, from Canada, and various other countries and have dialogues and conversations to try and hopefully make a proposal that would suspend the incarceration of those who have mental illnesses. The UN looked into this and looked into the research behind these proposals and then came up with language that could be instated. The language was a little bit difficult to interpret, but it was eventually included within the convention. Another group that was mentioned was deaf and blind people, and they asked me if I would be involved helping them, and I did. So my point is, my work is global. It's not just with deaf people or just with women. I have learned so much from so many different affinity groups that I've been very honored to work with.
Now you have to understand that the United Nations has a lot of important conventions. And they recognize both civil and political rights. They also look at social issues and economic issues, and also cultural access. And within that is education. They've looked at women's rights, they looked at the rights of children, they have looked at those who have been tortured or who've suffered abuse. And so we thought it was important that they also look at the rights of the disabled. And all of these groups have had their rights recognized, but a convention was never written that officially affirmed those. So now we have the rights for the disabled, which includes these various groups, and so we're now affiliated with them. Now, going through this process, working on this has been very interesting. And I'll give you an example from what we experienced in the past. We looked at civil and political rights, and people have been working on these for 40 years. The rights of women, people have been working on those for at least 2 decades. The rights for children, individuals have been looking at that for at least a decade. But when we look at the disabled and their rights, the convention is only 5 years in the making. And you might wonder why that's such a recent occurrence. Part of that, I think, is the technology. You know, in the past we didn't have fax machines. We'd have the old ditto machines where we'd make the 1,000,000 copies. We'd send them by boat, and it would take months for correspondence to get across the world, and we'd see what the news was from a month ago. But in today's world, technology makes things much more instantaneous. You know, you have the internet. You have immediate communication through email. So it's been such a huge change in terms of access. Now I get tons of papers sent to me and I can respond immediately. You can have back-to-back meetings, and we've looked at different disabled groups and again communicated through email. The government has asked us for submissions, and they'll immediately get submissions from those who are deaf or blind or different groups, but it's much better, much stronger if you can submit together. And within that submission, make sure your needs are being addressed. And I think working together is the best way to approach it. And that's what we've tried to do, is to make these proposals as one united group. And I have to tell you, one of my first meetings, it was just horrendous. There were so many different groups together, and we tried to come together as one. We would meet the UNESCO and the World Federation of Health and the International Disabled Alliance and the children's organizations would be willing to meet in one central location. But the World Federation of the Deaf has a different style. We have a voted president, we do have a board, and we have different organizations who serve on that board, much like a government. And of course, we have a general meeting where people can stand to raise their points or to vote. But the UN is different. They have a variety of agendas from different countries, for example, different conventions, and they're working on different projects. So they have the UNESCO, plus they deal with the different national governments, and they have their own structure with all the different levels of the United Nations. So the United Nations had a number of meetings, and at their 61st meeting, which will take place later this year, we'll be discussing this. There is an ad hoc committee, and I have to tell you, it's very interesting. There were 80 individuals who showed up, who attended the first meeting, and at the final meeting, the last meeting, there was 800, so you can imagine the size of the delegation. We've been meeting for years now, and people learn things like, for example, how to wave in sign language. There's also a president, and at the last meeting, the president was ready to say, "Are we all in favor?" He banged his mallet, and 800 people stood up and waved. Row after row after row, waving their hands. It was such a moving moment. I felt, hooray, I was so happy to see that. So it was a very nice moment in history to have experienced. From that meeting, the document was given to the lawyers for wordsmithing and for more editing. It was then ratified, and the United Nations government signed off on it. It didn't become binding at that point. The United States signed off on it as well. So they were one of the signatories, and several countries became signatories for it. The purpose was they would go back to their home countries, work with the document, and then ratify it at a national level, and then bring it back to the UN. The convention has two different documents. There's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then there's also the protocol, which is an addendum to the CRPD. If there are protests against the CRPD, they can refer to the protocol. Some of the governments were willing to sign the actual convention, and we had 43 countries who were signatories. Only 80 countries were willing to sign the protocol itself. And there was concern that there would be protests about one or both documents. We must have at least 20 national states to ratify the treaty for it to become enforced. And several months passed, and it was ratified in the South American countries and in the Pan American countries, in Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, and so quite quickly ratified in those countries. I met one woman from Chile, and they had signed it, they'd ratified it quickly. She was worried that some of the legislation was a bit weak, and she was wondering what would happen, how programs would be created from the convention itself. But apparently in Chile, they adopted it quite quickly, and the legislation was passed, so it was a very quick process. So there are 5 specific articles that I'd like to talk about, and they address sign language specifically. There's 29, 24, 21, and 30. So I don't want you to forget it, so can you tell me which ones? Oh, it's Article 2, Article 3, 21, 24, 30. Okay, so those are the articles to keep in mind. Those are the ones that address language rights for the deaf. So several individuals wanted this type of information included. The UN initially said no. They said we couldn't make a shopping list of our wants and needs and that it wouldn't be acceptable. They wanted something that was more representative of the different levels, but not specific. So you can look through it and see what it includes. We wanted to use a definition for language in a very simple form. So we said language that was in spoken or signed format. And then they wanted to add other forms of non-spoken languages. I'm not sure why, but if you look at this, they might want something like Latin or Sanskrit. And there are many dead languages that do have a written form, but there's no spoken form anymore. And I was a little concerned about that, but I didn't want to challenge the UN. For me, it was important that they'd included spoken and sign languages were of equal value. There is a definition of communication, but it only talks about language. Prior to that, it says sign language is a true and real language. And I do have to tell you, we had many discussions during the 5 years of how to define the concept of disability. There are a lot of different groups who have different philosophies about how it's defined. People wanted to talk about disabilities such as medical conditions. There are some individuals with disabilities, for example, Indigenous groups from Canada, who wanted to be included with the disabilities because they felt they had the same experiences. And as a Native Canadian, they've seen their children removed from their families and forced to use English and not their Indigenous language, and then taught a foreign language as a child in school. And they've had bad experience. There's problems with literacy. Also, the level of education in the Indigenous communities is low. And of course, we've had lots of experiences that as deaf individuals. Our language has been oppressed, their language has been oppressed. And they said there's 60% disabled Indigenous Canadians, which is quite a high. And if you look at children, for example, that's quite a high percentage. The final decision, the UN said in their preamble that disability is a developing concept that is evolving over time, and that we'd have to see with time where the definition led. And in the very first article, it says this is for the rights of specific groups, and then outlines 4 specific groups: physical disabilities, mental disabilities, but for example, individuals with Down syndrome and various developmental challenges. And then the final was sensory disabilities, which I hate that term, but that's where they put sensory and mobility. And so that was deaf, blind, so anything related to the sensory system. So those are the 4 groups they recognized in their preamble. If someone is temporarily sick or incapacitated, if they have some kind of medical condition, they decided that would not be considered in the definition of disabilities. But various nations can, of their own accord, add that to their definition of what disabled means. But at a minimum, they have to follow the 4 groups as identified in the preamble of the CRPD. This article states that an individual should have access to every aspect of life and society, for example, employment. One thing that it mentions is the use of sign language interpreters and access to that. Some of the government officials said, I'm sorry, but in my country, we see the children of deaf parents helping them. And so that's access to interpreters for them. But in our proposal, we specify professional sign language interpreters, and you may wonder why. Some people say, doesn't this support the employment of these children? We said no. We wanted to have professional sign language interpreters, and I was happy with that decision. It's important for us as deaf individuals to understand this article. If this is ratified by governments, it requires those countries to provide sign language. And they must then accept that sign language is a real language. It's not a gesture-based system of communication. Talks about the acceptance and promotion with persons with disabilities of a sign language. So again, the governments have to accept that in various regions there are deaf individuals who use a sign language. Often when they communicate with the government or anyone else, it's through this sign language. The Russian delegation wanted this to be removed, but after several minutes of discussion, they were willing to support this statement in the article. So many countries, for example, might have legislation, but some don't. For example, the UK and Japan, there is nothing in legislation about sign language, and there seems to have been no attempt to legalize it, whereas there are other countries with other documents where parliaments agreed, officially recognized at the governmental level. Also promotion. If we look at promotion, what does that mean? This should be the use of sign language in any aspect of life, with the family and education. If there's research being done at the university, in employment settings, there should be the promotion of sign language, and these two go hand in hand. So I really like this article. Yes, I see people in the audience saying they like it as well.
The next article I'd like to discuss is pertaining to education. This was a difficult struggle. In the beginning, I had been working on the convention, and I believe the last 2 years of our discussion with this, Marku had come as a delegate with me to have discussions and to give documentations to our ad hoc committees about this. Everyone wanted to talk about inclusive education, but we wanted to talk about sign language being provided within an environmental area as well as inclusion. The group of visually impaired and blind people were listening to this discussion, and for several years they as well wanted to talk about their needs for having the same inclusion rights as deaf people, because oftentimes children who are blind that are in mainstream settings do not have access to Braille. Obviously, you know, they can't read in a similar way that other students can. They can't use computer technology as other sighted students can. So they were interested in having the same type of support that deaf people were asking for. Mobility impaired students were also feeling the need to be included in this. For example, if there's stairwells or if there's other physical blockages in their educational systems, they cannot be independent and work as freely as their non-disabled counterparts, especially within the mainstream setting. So environmental equality and accessibility was a very important concern for all of our three groups. Those people who are deaf-blind maybe partially see or partially hear with aids also realized that they needed to be included within this grouping. So the four communities came together to write a proposal. This was a daunting responsibility. How do we gain rights for people? How does this actually happen? These rights are important for our deaf children. Linguistic and cultural identity is key. Just knowing sign language alone is not enough. People need to have literacy skills. People need to have languages that they are capable of communicating in, and they need to form a community that uses those language. That's a linguistic community, and it's a linguistic identity. This, again, is another important concept that we fought for. It's important for our children who are deaf in mainstream settings, who are not exposed to sign language, need to have some fluency in communication. We have to come up with plans for these children to help them, whether it be sign, whether it be other methods of communication that's suitable for that individual child. There has to be environmental accessibility as well as educational accessibility, so communication for them is available at all levels of their life and all parts of their life. And those communications need to be direct communications. It was important for us that deaf children were exposed to teachers who were themselves deaf and also fluent in the language, and they were qualified specialists in their own language. Blind people then said the same thing. People who had mobility impairments said the same things once we brought it up. But it was important that the deaf people have right to easy accent, fluent, and appropriate communication directly from their peers. Different disabilities and different disability organizations have their own needs. If you look at the deaf community, the linguistic identity is key, sign language is key, cultural independence is key, and governments need to support that, and this is another example of that that's written in the document. Where do people get full access in this world? It's very rare. It's important that we continually work towards this. And hopefully this CRPD will open the doors for all of us to have the opportunity to experience the identities which we all deserve and are respected for the identities that which we hold within our culture. These concepts are very important for all human rights, not just deaf people. Those people with disabilities need to have this acceptance, but we have to remember that as deaf people, we have had a cultural identity that has been in existence for a long time. We need an official declaration, and we need an international acceptance and recognition of our linguistic culture. Throughout the world, governments, countries, educational environments have very often oppressed deaf people, and their rights have been taken from them. The use of sign language has not been recognized, their culture has not been recognized, and they have been oppressed universally. It is important for all of us to continue this fight and not to sit back and let it go unchecked. The view of deaf people, I'm sure we are all familiar with and have heard. There's the pathological perspective, the medical perspective. Luckily, that changed and then became the social, cultural, or the cultural, anthropological, linguistic perspective. Then from that, luckily, it has broadened to full equality of human rights and seen in a different way. All of us have the right to have the same life that is fulfilling for each of us, no matter what our condition or our state. And that is where we are today, luckily. One of our goals was to educate people and to change their thinking. Oftentimes, people thought of a disability group as being one closed group and saw them with different labels and didn't see them as people. But we need to consider that all of us are equal as human beings. We might have variations in who we are and what our identities are, but we are all part of the human race, and diversity is included within the concept of being human. So yes, diversity is a beautiful thing, but within that diversity, we are all basically human and need to be treated as such. H is another interesting construct that I really appreciate. This talks about respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, in respect to their right of children to preserve their own identity. We have been working tirelessly just as you have, many nations have come together, many universities have come together as one throughout the world to fight for our rights. I hope that this mission and this excitement fills you with hope, and we also hope that the United States will sign and ratify, after all the work that we have done, this convention. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate everything. Thank you for your invitation to be here, and I appreciate me having the opportunity to speak to you this evening.